Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large. This is brought to you on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, and also, of course, with video on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. You know, I've been having a lot of fun doing this podcast and doing my YouTube channel and engaging in the work that I do. It's not always easy and it's not always fun, but for the most part it is. I'm very lucky to be doing work that is not really work for me, and to be able to scrape out a living doing this with your guys' support. And I just wanted to take a moment and thank you guys, not just for those of you who are Patreon supporters or anything. This isn't a pitch. I'm honestly, I wanted to thank you guys just for your good wishes and your support and your helpful and positive comments. As a semi-public figure, when you put yourself out there and start throwing ideas around and throwing out opinions and what you think are facts or rational, reasonable things to say, and you run into various shades of disagreement and upset and ire that some of those ideas and opinions provoke, it can seem like there are a lot of people against you. And it's not really necessarily that way when you look at the numbers, but sometimes it seems that way. One negative comment will stay with you for hours, whereas 10 positive comments, you go, you guys, But those don't stay with you when that one negative, nasty Nelly is out for your blood, And it weighs on me sometimes, and it's something I've learned to deal with. This isn't also a bid for sympathy. I'm just letting you guys know that sometimes there's criticism of my work out there. Sometimes that criticism surprises me, and sometimes it doesn't. And it's helpful to know, it's been very helpful actually, to look at the positive support that I get, which I get far more than I get criticism, which I think is a good thing, and just acknowledge to you guys that I appreciate that, I see it, and I very, very much appreciate it. So, that being said, we have another very special guest on the podcast this week, and one that I was very, very happy to bag. His name is Matt Dillahunty, and he is, his Wikipedia page here says that he is an American public speaker and internet personality. And please don't let this put you off, but he is or was the president of the Atheist community of Austin from 2006 to 2013, and he is an outspoken atheist. However, while we do talk about atheism and religion, we also talk about critical thinking and reasonable speech and rationality, and that is way more important to me than atheism. And I have found, in looking at Matt Dillahunty's public speaking, that he is a brilliant speaker when it comes to logic and critical thinking. And it's that which he talks about that appeals to me way more than the religious aspect of it, and that's why I asked him to be on the show. So of course we're going to talk about, atheism as well and belief and that sort of thing. But Matt came to Denver months ago and spoke at the Secular Hub, and what struck me about his speech was his proclivity to tolerance and understanding of people of belief, people with religious beliefs. He's not a hater. He's not a militant extremist atheist, and he's not somebody who's out to, take down religion as such. And so I really hope that you give our interview a fair shake and listen to what he has to say, because I think he's got some amazingly intelligent things to say. So, just a little bit more about him is that he has hosted a cable access television show called The Atheist Experience down in Austin since 2005, and that can be seen weekly. And of course you'll find him on YouTube, and he is a prominent debater and public speaker. He goes around and he walks the walk, and he does some pretty good debates out there as well. And he's been concentrating on that a lot lately. On his channel is trying to teach about debate, and regardless of your position, those are good skills to have. It doesn't just apply to to atheists. So, without further ado, here is Matt Dillahunty. Okay, Matt, so thank you very much for being on my show.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, so first off, just for my listeners and whatnot, what is your background in education? How did you get into being an advocate for, atheism and skepticism?
Yeah, so the background in education is really simple, virtually none. I'm almost completely self-taught in everything, but I grew up fundamentalist Southern Baptist, got saved at around the age of 5 and walked down the aisle, and was active in the church and in ministry efforts, and was convinced, along with much of my family and some of my friends, that God wanted me to be a preacher. That I like some of the other kids in my youth group, I took it seriously. I knew a lot about the Bible. I was convinced and a sincere believer, and I don't know, people saw things and said, you need to be a preacher. God wants you to be a preacher. And I was absolutely terrified of public speaking, and I didn't want to do any of that. And I left and joined the Navy. I was in the Navy for about a little over 8 years, and then ended up moving. I'm originally from Missouri and had been in the Navy on the West Coast, or sorry, the East Coast, and ended up in Austin, Texas, because of a friend of mine from the Navy who worked at Dell. I spent a number of years doing hardware testing for motherboards and software testing for various applications. And then in around 2000, 2001, when I lost yet another job for doing too good, essentially. You work yourself out of a job. Hey, you've done so well. We have nothing for you to do for the next 6 months. We need to downsize because the market's terrible, so we're letting you go. Wow. And I thought that God was punishing me. I'd spent probably most of the time in the Navy and most of the 7 or 8 years prior to this in the tech industry. I didn't go to church. I didn't care about. I still believed, and if anybody asked, and we'd talk about it, and I would have, disagreements with my friends, but it wasn't a big deal in my life. My purpose at that point was, hey, let's build a career, in part because I don't have a degree. So here I am, lead engineer for workstations alongside 2 guys with, master's degrees in computer science, and having to go head to head with them and proving myself. And then when it turns out I did the job as good or better, because I lacked seniority and degrees, I was still the one who got cut when it was time to cut people. So there was certainly a chip on my shoulder against degrees, but I surrendered. I was like, okay, God, if you want me to be a preacher, if you're punishing me, if you basically took away my career because I wasn't doing what you wanted me to do, I'll do it. And I had an uncle who was a medical doctor and a former missionary, and I had spoken to him about some things. My roommate at the time was an atheist. And my goal was, okay, if I'm going to do this, if I'm actually going to be the preacher that God wants me to be, my roommate needs to know about God. He needs to know about Jesus. I've got to find a way to explain this to my atheist roommate. And while he and I never had a conversation about it, the year and a half of prayer and study that I was doing at that time led me to ultimately say, hey, I don't have good reasons for what I believe. I've been wrong all these years. Not that, I can prove it false, but all the things that I thought confirmed and proved it true were just my own ignorance. I didn't understand, epistemology. I didn't understand skepticism, critical thinking. I believed, in part because everybody around me believed, because when you're standing up and singing and praising, and you feel goosebumps or whatever else, and everybody around you says, oh, that's the Holy Spirit, you just go, oh yeah, that's what it is. Maybe that's not what it is. How do we demonstrate that? And then I stumbled, I did a ton of reading, and I didn't immediately call myself an atheist, partly because I had a misunderstanding about what that word even means.
I understand that.
And so what I did do is I started writing for an online magazine that was pretty much anybody can post things. I mean, there was an editor who would select stuff. And there was 1 or 2 individuals who would write a sermon. There was one guy who went by a pseudonym of Skip to Malou, who would pick out a passage in the Bible and write a sermon on it from a Christian perspective. And as sort of an exercise in exposing what I'd learned about these topics, I would take the exact same passage and show how it could be interpreted in a bunch of different ways, and sometimes in the exact opposite way of what he was doing. And my point wasn't to say you are in fact wrong. It's to say merely claiming that your interpretation is the right one is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to writing articles on skepticism, because I'd been a skeptic long before I was an atheist. I just was only skeptical about ghosts and Ouija boards and dowsing and crap like that. It never even occurred to me during those years to be skeptical about God. That was just true. It was obviously to everybody around. Doesn't everybody believe? Even though I would know, no, everybody doesn't believe. And I remember on Mondays we'd go out for visitation. Basically, anybody who showed up at church would fill out a visitor's card, and if they filled out a visitor's card, we would go visit them on Monday. And I know that many of the people that we visited were people who were already believers but were new to the area and were looking for church. But on some occasions, they would be non-believers who stumbled into a church. But that label, that non-believer, that wasn't atheist. I mean, it is, but at the time, my mind said, "Oh, that's not an atheist," because my only understanding of atheist came from my mom. Actually, I remember it was either during the summertime or I was home from school and I was watching TV and my mom was in the kitchen, and there was this woman on TV on Merv Griffin saying all kinds of nasty things about Jesus and religion and everything else. And my mom came in and turned it off, and she says, You're not supposed to watch that. That's that evil atheist woman who's trying to destroy God's country and bring Satan to the world," or something along those lines. And of course, it was Madeline Murray O'Hare, but I didn't realize that until many, many years later. So that my study, by the way, continues. I've been hosting the TV show for almost 12 years. I still regularly study what Christian apologists have to say, still study what various versions of the Bible and translations and other things. And I'm by no means an expert. I have no expertise in anything other than possibly taking some kind of dense philosophical concepts and being able to explain them in a way that almost anybody can understand, because that's what I had to do for me to be able to understand it. Get past the jargon, get past the graduate level degree stuff, and distill this down to where anybody can understand it.
Right.
And that's, the only thing I'm an expert in probably is my own opinion, and maybe not even that, because I've disagreed with myself as well. So
Interesting. Well, that's good. And so you basically educated yourself out of that belief system.
yeah, and that's kind of what I've always done for almost everything. I was really bored in high school. We didn't even get, I graduated in 1987, and we didn't even get any computers in our school to work with until I think my junior year is when we really started getting some computers to work with. And I would skip classes and go down there and teach myself that. If there's something that I'm interested in, I just, read and study and devour it until I have, I don't know, maybe, hopefully, something slightly higher than the dilettante level introductory. I know enough to be dangerous. I want to know just more than enough to be dangerous. So.
Right. Yeah, again, very similar. Now, was there a specific point that you can look back on? Maybe you didn't recognize it at the time it happened, although, I'm kind of wondering where you crossed a line, where you went, okay, I'm a believer, there's a God, this is how it is, to, this just ain't how it is.
Yeah, there wasn't. I didn't have like an epiphany or anything.
Right.
What happened? I was reading with the goal of trying to figure out how to convince my atheist roommate, and so I was reading what atheists were saying with regard to my religion or versions of my religion, because they never got it right. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and that's because there's as many different Southern Baptist denominations as there are Southern Baptists, but I had read the Bible as a kid and as a teenager, and again as an adult during this time period. And then when somebody would write something that was critical of the Bible, I would say, "Hang on, that's not what it says. You're taking it out of context. You managed to get this wrong, or there's something more to it." And in some cases, that's exactly the case. If you go online and look for like a list of Bible contradictions, there's this massive chart, and I constantly tell atheists, please don't reference those things. Make sure you study this stuff, because the overwhelming majority of them apologists are aware of and have an explanation that is at least plausible, um, even if you want to say that, okay, they're just tap dancing around to make it fit. It's
Right.
at least plausible, so it's not going to be convincing. But there were other things where I would read the criticism of the passage and say, oh, that's not quite right. And what I would find is that when I went and researched it, not only was it quite right, the atheists tended to have it, in some cases, more correct than what I had learned.
Mm.
The Elisha and the bears, where he curses the 42 children for calling him bald, and two she bears come and rip them all apart. That one's ended up being one of my favorites because uh, there's a lot of potential discussion there. Because the view from the Christian perspective is Elisha is a man of God, and these people were mocking and threatening him, and he cursed them in the name of God, and then these she bears came and ripped them apart. Um, and this was just. This was a lesson to don't mock the prophets of God. What it actually says is, go up thou bald head, which you can say is, oh my gosh, that's the most offensive insult ever. And then the bears came and ripped up 42 children, and then they will argue that, well, they weren't really children; they were like a gang. So, and I keep thinking, I don't care if they're Crips and Bloods; they were calling names. And then
They got the death penalty. Yeah.
even after going through all this, Ray Comfort was questioned about this at one point, and he made a really good point that is simultaneously good and stupid. And that is, he said, does the Bible say that God sent those bears? No, it doesn't. It just says Elisha cursed them in the name of God, and two she bears came out and ripped them up. And so somebody was like, well, Ray, do you think it's a coincidence? And he says, well, it could be. Then why would you include it? The entire Ray is so desperate to make the Bible not evil that he's willing to throw out the entire purpose and think that in this book we have a story about somebody mocking a man of God, and then just by coincidence, after he curses them in the name of God, a couple of bears come and rip him up. You don't get to put that on God's head.
Right.
It's bizarre the kind of leaps that they'll go through to avoid seeing the things that I saw, because I would read this and say, oh, that's not in the Bible, it's not in there this way, and then I would go and research and find out that it was. And while it wasn't one thing, it was a series of those where I reached a point where I was like, I don't know for sure what I am. I still think there's a God. I might even still be a Christian, but I definitely, the step one is I cannot accept what the Bible has to say. It's simply, it's bizarre, it's contradictory, it is immoral, it is unsourced. There's no way to verify that the information in there is accurate. Um, and so the Bible falls away by the wayside. And then that takes Christianity with it fairly quickly for me, because if you can't look at the Bible, where do you get any of this? Where do you get any? There's nothing left. And so then it became kind of, well, do I believe in some kind of nebulous God? And I've joked for years that I started to study different religions and then realized I wouldn't have enough time in my life to investigate all the various religions. So I immediately shifted to Buddhism to find out if I would have multiple lifetimes to investigate this, which led to a bunch of other things. But what it really led to was, okay, how do I best direct this search? I need to study philosophy. I need to have a better understanding of epistemology. I need to apply, critical thinking and skepticism to all of these claims so that I can find out, hey, let's figure out first what kind of God might exist so that we can decide which categories of religions we might want to discover. And basically that cut them all off at the knees.
Wow. What do you say to people who are casual believers, not fundamentalists, not hardcore militants, but people who are like, look, it makes me feel better. I like it. I know the Bible's not literal truth. Give me a break. Of course it's not literal truth. It's parables, it's metaphors, it's morality stories, right? It's that sort of thing. How do what do you say to that, refrain to yeah, I can't take the Bible at its word. And they go, well, neither do I. But I still believe because the Bible, is the good book.
Oh, well, see, that's just, I mean, that final thing that you added just makes it a blatant contradiction. Well, I don't believe the Bible, but I believe the Bible. Oh, congratulations. You know, I've run across this a lot, and really the reason I think um, is that people have been raised in a culture, or they have a background, or they have family members who have these beliefs, and they've started to move away from them, but they are terrified of just giving it up because they'll think, oh, well, Pascal's wager. What if I'm wrong? What if it turns out, maybe I better hedge my bets and at least be a kind of believer, so that if I die and, find myself in front of God, I can say, hey, I always believed in you. Wasn't too sure about all this stuff, but do you think you could fool God? I mean, how bizarre is that? If there is a God, doesn't he know exactly what was going through your mind when you decided to play Let's Make a Safe Bet? But for most of them, I get it. There's an appeal. There's a lot of different appeals. There's, from a purely social perspective, going to church and being involved with a community of people, even if you don't believe, is beneficial.
That's right.
It's one of the things that we're encouraging the secular and atheist community to do more of, which is things like Oasis and Sunday Assembly and community structures that'll give people a landing place when they come out of religious beliefs. But I'm I'm an atheist because I care about whether or not my beliefs are true. Even, so much I put it on a T-shirt. I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. I actually care about more about whether it's true than whether it's comforting. And so when people say, "Well, I don't really believe that the Bible's literally true, but I still think there's something there," then the question is, why? Why do you think that? Is it because it's comforting? Is it because of what you've been raised on? Is it because you haven't looked at it critically? Do you, I've talked to people who, when I ask them this, and I say, "Well, what is the evidence for your thing?" "Oh, well, there isn't any evidence. It's just something you take on faith."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, please tell me any position that one couldn't take on faith. There's nothing. You could say anything and say, "Oh, there's no evidence for this. There's no evidence that whites are superior to black or men are superior to women, but I'm going to believe it based on faith." We don't use that for anything other than these emotionally appealing, spurious notions. This idea of, well, in my daily life, I would try to use reason and evidence and critical thinking for most things, but because I get away with a few things, like I know the ice cream's bad for me, but it feels good, so I'm going to eat it anyway. Because that doesn't seem to be too terribly bad. I know the religion's probably BS, but I'm going to go ahead and accept it anyway because there's good things that come along with it. And I'm not like the Westboro Baptist people who are running around, protesting funerals and with their God hates fag signs and all that stuff.
Right.
I'm one of the better ones. Well, yeah, that may be the case, and I'll applaud people all day long. But it is the liberal and moderate, and in this case, I'm primarily speaking about Christians, in order to make this example. Liberal and moderate Christians tend to point back to the Bible. They might not agree on how much of it is literal, but they have to use that as a foundation because, like I said, if you remove the Bible, where did you get your ideas about Jesus?
Right.
And what the liberal and moderate Christians do, and Sam Harris has pointed this out as well, is they serve as a sort of shield for the fundamentalists. They
Mm-hmm.
serve as a legitimizer for it. Oh, yes, those people have taken it a bit too far, but it's still fundamentally true. When the truth, as far as I can tell, is those people are actually literally reading what's on the page, and you are making excuses for it and changing what your view is based on something else. The Bible condones slavery explicitly.
Yep.
Any Bible believing person who does not condone slavery is in opposition to their holy book. And they've now said, no, my understanding of the reality of morality is superior to what the book says. And I will agree with them all day long. You are better than your book. You are better than the God you believe in. You are better than all these things. Let's talk about why you're still clinging to the things that you're clinging to. Because if you don't have any good reason, you should dump it. And if you're going to say that it's all based on faith, the best thing to do is point out, is there anything else that you take on faith and why? Is there anything we couldn't accept on faith? Because faith isn't a pathway to truth. It's not a pathway to understanding. Faith is the excuse people give when they don't have a good reason for something they really like believing.
Well, yeah, and I think that it has a lot to do with emotional comfort, and what makes people feel good always trumps what people can logically figure out.
Yeah.
So it sort of seems to be the way we're made up, you know.
Well,
I think that's the basic struggle, is that emotion-based thinking versus logical or reasonable fact-based thinking.
but the thing is, you don't have to dump emotion. It's not like atheists are, Vulcans. It's
No, I know. I tried to
hu-
point that out, but you
uh,
know.
and in fact, so I'm a skeptic first.
Mhm.
Um, I'm a humanist first. Those are the two foundational positions, and I'm an atheist as a subsidiary to skepticism, and it tells you nothing about um, my ethical positions. Um, and so, as a humanist, one of the things I talk about when I talk about morality is this idea that empathy is in fact important. Um, we get this idea in our head that if we're going to make appeals to truth, oh no, that argument from emotion, those are fallacious things. No, they can be fallacious, but we are human beings who live in a society that's shared. We interact with other people. The things I do have effects on you, and vice versa. Me picking up this Gatorade bottles doesn't affect you right now, but there are interactions, and recognizing that, and the idea that emotions aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's about making sure that the decisions you base on emotions are measured, that you have also assessed the consequences of those things beyond just this is appealing. You don't have to, when you introduce emotion into the equation, you're introducing humanity. You are introducing what makes us beings that interact with each other. But some people want to pretend that merely introducing emotion automatically means, oh, it's hedonism, it's anything goes, it's I want to kill you, and therefore that's the only factor. It is the oversimplification that gets us in trouble with regard to moral issues, ethical issues, and also with beliefs, because a lot of people will say, hey, I'm not like Westboro, I have these beliefs, and they don't affect anybody. I'm not trying to
Right.
legislate my opinions on
That's
this.
right.
Well, that might be the case. It might be that you're not trying to legislate. You might be, the Reverend Barry Lynn and I, he runs Americans United for Separation Church and State. We agree on church-state separation. We disagree on the God thing. And he might be one of the Christians who I am most in agreement with on most issues, including a lot of social issues. But if you think that you can believe something and it doesn't affect anything, you have deluded yourself, because the thought processes that allowed you to believe that thing that is false will allow you to believe other things that are false. And the conclusion also gets used as a premise in these, because if you believe, like saying, well, I don't know, but I believe there's a God, then it's going to be much, much easier for someone to start convincing you about specifics of that God, because you have a God belief, I don't.
Right.
They have a lot more work to do to get me along that path, which is where you get to the Voltaire quote about, if you can get people to believe absurdities, you can get them to commit atrocities.
Yeah, exactly. All right, different topic here now. Again, you and I have very similar ideas about a lot of things. And for example, you've recently said that you think that everyone has their own ideas about who and what God is. And I've made the comparison to how I think that belief is like DNA. I think no two people completely share anyone else's beliefs. I think everybody's got their own. If you could peer into their head, you'd see something different from what the Christian sitting right next to them is thinking, even though they're both calling themselves Christians, right?
Yeah, there would certainly be subtle differences. How varied they are depends.
That's right. And I think this is because of how we come to believe things. You've taken a position that belief is not a choice, and I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I've taken that position, or I've said in the past, I believe that belief is a choice. So you can, by that I mean you can change your mind at any point, and the belief changes. So what do you mean when you say that belief is not a choice?
Um, so this is going to be fun. Uh,
Okay.
what I've said is that belief is not simply a matter of choice. It's not like you can say, okay, I now believe in God. That is not the case. That's not how we describe belief. That's not what belief is. Belief is the state of being convinced that something is true or likely true. And you can be convinced for good reasons or bad reasons, but it's always the result of becoming convinced. It's not like hey, I'm just going to choose to believe that gravity doesn't apply to me. I'm going to choose to believe that a God exists. That's not the way we ever come to a belief. Even, I walked down the aisle at the age of 5 at a revival. I didn't just, no matter how many times they sing, I have decided to follow Jesus, I decided how I was going to act, but becoming convinced that this was the right thing was a process, not a choice. It's not like I said, I sat there and listened to a preacher for a while and said, okay, I'm going to choose to believe in God. Instead, it is, okay, his arguments have convinced me that this is most likely the case. And so that's the distinction on belief as a choice. I, without digging into, free will and agency too much, which can become cumbersome,
Yes.
I cannot think of an example and have not been provided with an example by anyone where at point A they did not believe, and at point B they do believe, and between point A and B was merely a choice. In every case, it may be the case that we, through our actions and through our thought processes, we determine what it takes to convince us, because certainly some people are more credulous than others. But I'm not even convinced that those things are a choice. As a matter of fact, it may be that we have no choice over anything at all, without dipping too far into the free will thing.
Yeah.
So when somebody says that they're convinced that the belief is a choice, I don't know that we're talking about the same thing. But if we are, I desperately want an example of how belief can be a choice.
I get what you're saying, and the point of process is it's a slightly different idea of the word choice, I think, between what I was saying and what you've just said. Because the idea is, in what I was saying or thinking, of course, is that you have a power of determination over your thought process. Now, whether you've come to that yourself, like you did through education, or whether somebody convinced you, in the end, the point of you changing your mind about a thing, about a belief, is what I meant by choice.
Sure, but I'll get back to like Sam Harris and others on this.
Mm-hmm.
If I think back to any time where I have changed my position,
Mm-hmm.
or any time where I have recognized, gone from I don't believe this to I do believe this. First of all, it doesn't feel like I've done anything. It feels more like something that has happened to me. I'm trudging along and I'm evaluating things, and nope, that's not enough evidence, and nope, that's not enough evidence, and then, oh, bam, now there's enough evidence and I'm convinced. There's no active volition. It's not like I said, today I'm going to think about God and make a choice. To the extent that one can do that, I think that what you're doing is attempting to find out whether or not you are convinced or whether or not you can convince yourself. And the choice that you make, if there's any choice, is what to do with respect to becoming convinced and what you do after you have become convinced. Because a God could come down and reveal himself to me right now, and that would convince me that there's a God, and I would no longer be an atheist. That doesn't mean that I would worship that God or revere or respect it. Maybe he's an evil monster. Maybe I just outright have a problem with the idea of worship. Anything deserving of worship would never demand it or expect it, is kind of the take. I've done that before. So I can, to the extent that I have any choice, I can choose what I do with the information. But how I became convinced of the fact is not a matter of choice. And I think one of the ways to demonstrate the absurdity of that is if a God appears and absolutely is capable of convincing me that it exists, or let's not even go to a God. Let's say you tell me you've got 4 $100 bills in your wallet, and I don't believe you. and then you open your wallet and show me, and there are four $100 bills there, the weight of the evidence that has been presented convinces me. And to say that belief is a choice would imply that I could choose to not believe that even after having been presented the evidence, because the belief choice has to work both ways.
Oh, but wait a minute. Now, right there, though, because there are people who are every day shown very convincing evidence of evolution, of all kinds of things.
Are they?
And well, this is what you and R and Ra do, right?
No. See, this is the thing: is you're saying that they've been shown very convincing evidence. They've been shown things that you find convincing, but
Well,
they
that's the
don't
thing,
find.
exactly. But then they're not
That's
convinced.
why I
So
went
that's
with
that.
the simple
So,
example.
so you're
Show me
okay. So you're saying
$100
there's this
bill.
bar of conviction that has to be met,
Yeah,
and then okay, and
that
I
is
would and
different.
I would interpret that and say, well, that's a choice, and you would look at that and go, well, it's not choice. It's determining what the
So the bar
yeah
at which point people become convinced is going to be different for everybody.
yes.
Um, and I won't say that that's not a function of choice or that choice doesn't play a role in that, because it
Yeah.
may. But I'm also not convinced that that's any simple choice. Um, Even the people who are engaged in denialism, like for example, if I open my wallet and pull out $100 bill, and we sit here at a round table with 100 people, and one of them's a member of the Treasury, and we've verified we have good reason to think I have a legit $100 bill.
Yeah.
At that point, anybody who doesn't believe, we can make a case that they have irrational standards of evidence, or that they are lying, or engaged in self-deception when they say they don't believe, because there's a difference between what you believe and what you say you believe. And to
Fair
the
enough.
extent that there's a choice, I don't see how choice plays any significant role in what you actually believe, but it can definitely play a significant role in what you profess. Uh,
Good point. Very good point. All right, we'll move on from that. You've definitely made a good case there.
sure.
Hey there. I just want to take a moment to let you know about a new website that I think you might find useful. I'm sure those of you who are listening to the show right now have been wondering about this mug sitting here that says "Got Logic." And those of you who are watching are wondering, where do I get logic? How do you get your fill? Well, fortunately for you, I have the answers. Introducing the Critical Merchandise Web Store, hosted by Spreadshirt.com. If you think that facts matter, that critical thinking is not just for breakfast anymore, and you want to let your friends know that their lack of logic is disturbing, then you need look no further than the Critical Merchandise website. By popular demand, I've put these products together for you guys, and I think you'll find all of them helpful and useful reminders to yourself and to others that sense, logic, and reason are something all of us could use a little bit more of in our lives. Check out Critical Merchandise Store by either using the link below on this channel or by looking on sensiblyspeaking.com at the Critical Merchandise link at the top of the page. 100% of the funds raised from your purchases go back to making this show and my YouTube channel a reality, and I really do appreciate your support. Check out Critical Merchandise today. Now, we also have, you and I also have very similar goals in educating about critical thinking and rational discourse. This is very evident from watching your talks, and they're very good talks, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk very practically about this. I think it's easy to see how, there's a kind of an anti-intellectualism going on in the United States. Would you agree that there is such a thing? The
And yeah,
strain of this?
in certain pockets, and it's really kind of a weird thing, because you will find, you know, it's more a matter of it seems to be a matter of convenience. So we're happy to talk about the brilliant discoveries and things within science that would be within the purview of intellectualism, provided they give us something in our lives that we like that doesn't conflict too much with the things that we don't. And as soon
Exactly.
as they don't, um, especially in election season, when you've got people standing up there saying, nope, nope, I don't believe in evolution and all this. I mean, that's just bizarre that in 2016, somebody running for office would be able to stand up there and proudly say something like that.
I know.
And it just shows that there's still a significant portion of the population that, when they modified the Pledge of Allegiance to include under God,
Hmm.
atheists have come up with a bunch of alternatives, including under Canada, one nation under Canada. But my favorite from Herb Silverman and others is one nation undereducated. And if you are undereducated, and if you have a bunch of bad ideas that are coming from religious views and other things, and you find a bunch of other people who are in a similar position, that's what sort of encourages the anti-intellectualism stuff,
Hmm.
because you have the impression. My wife's from East Tennessee, and she has a glorious accent that I just could love to listen to her talk all the time. Unfortunately, when you listen to people on television, on TV shows, they are pretty much accent free. I was fortunate enough to be raised in the Missouri area, even though I live in Texas, and so I don't carry I can talk with a Southern drawl if I want to, and when I'm around best folks, and I sometimes do it accidentally. And when I was in England, I sounded a little more English, and when I was in Australia, I sounded a little more Australian because I'm a bit of a chameleon in that sense. But you don't hear that. And in the United States, there's this perception that if you speak with the sort of accent that we associate with the South, you're an idiot.
Yeah, that is true.
And so when she sees or hears a doctor or some character on a TV show who's the bright one and the good guy, and has an accent like hers, she gets incredibly excited. I've actually given talks about accent shaming, about how ignorant that is. I mean, it's not far removed from racism or any other form of bigotry where you've picked out a characteristic and created a stereotype.
Right.
But if you're one of those people, if you speak within a Southern drawl, and you know that society has looked at you as inferior, as you're the redneck deep South, you don't know nothing, then there's already a motivation to stand in opposition to what is portrayed as intellectualism, because intellectualism never comes. More often, it's going to come with a British accent. I mean, if you're going to mimic a smart sounding person, you go with a British accent. And yet,
Which itself is its own form of bigotry, really.
it is. It is. I know plenty of people with British accents who are idiots.
Complete morons. I know. I've met total idiot British people.
But so these stereotypes play in, and so what happens is because of the in-group out-group mentality, the intellectuals, those people with letters after their name, they are the bad guys because you feel that they've been, oppressing you or looking down on you. And so to even the playing field, you're going to look down on them. So I wouldn't even completely tie this to religious ideology. I think there's a lot more to it than just religion.
I agree. I definitely agree. I think it's a political thing. I think there's a lot of motivations to it. I'm curious, what do you think would be a solution to this situation?
It's probably the same thing the same solution I have for racism, which is when we're all the same color, when we've intermixed enough to where we look more alike and sound more alike. I like seeing non-standard characters on TV shows and stuff like that. So the thing is, I've dealt a lot with bigotry directed at atheists, and you might have a neighbor down the street who you've known for years, and they're, one of the good neighbors. They, keep their yard nice, and they help out with the block parties and all this other stuff, and you know nothing about them. But you automatically assume, because you like them, that they are like you.
Mm-hmm.
When you find out that they are the godless heathen on your block, that's jarring.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the reasons that, I even got a tattoo for the Out campaign, although we can't quite see it. But encouraging people to be out, because it's harder to hate and vilify gay people if somebody in your family's gay. You count the number of, sorry, but they're almost always Republicans. Count the number of Republican politicians who were vehemently anti-gay until their son, daughter, niece, nephew, next door neighbor, whatever, come out as gay, and then all of a sudden they change their mind.
Right.
It's harder to be anti-atheist if your, best friend or your neighbor, now know that they're a godless heathen. I mean, and atheists fit every. I mean, they pick up your trash and they will change your kidney.
Yep. Every demographic is represented.
And the same thing is true with the barriers along dialects. I've had a doctor who his southern drawl was so thick I could barely understand. And I've had people who, that's the other thing is we get this idea of they sound normal or not normal.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this idea of normalizing all of it. And I work with black non-believers and ex-Muslims of North America and those groups, getting to realize that we're making mistakes with labels. That labels are a shortcut that we use to make it easier to communicate.
Yep.
Just like any other word, and they're only as effective as our ability to have a shared usage of them. So, if I say Coke, getting back to the Southern roots things, and by that you think it means Coca-Cola, and really in the South, Coke is every soft drink. What kind of Coke you want? I'll have a Sprite.
Right.
That, to me, coming from Missouri, I'm like, I just want to smack them. No, Sprite and Coke are not the same. You don't get to do that. But getting to the point where we realize that those things are there and that it's not the end of the world, that we don't have to be prescriptivist about language. I identify as a skeptic and a humanist and an atheist and a feminist and all these other things. And not until I added feminist did I get a bunch of crap from people. And it's because, and by the way, I get crap from feminists and from MRAs, men's rights advocates and other things. And it's because the label applies to too many different positions on many different subjects.
That's right.
So if you ask somebody, what's the feminist position on pornography? There isn't one. If you talk to Taslima Nasreen or Sensara Taylor, they are vehemently anti-porn. If you talk to Greta Christina, who's also a feminist, she is a former sex worker who edits a porn magazine. And I'm hoping to do an interview with Nina Hartley at some point, she's been doing porn since before I was watching porn and continues to work in that industry and is a brilliant secular feminist. So if you don't know anything and somebody tells you, hey, I'm a feminist, and you like porn, and the only feminists you've ever really interacted with hate porn, then you just start making assumptions that this is the thing. Exactly. So the labels prevent us from having the conversations we need. I'm not advocating for throwing out all labels. I had an argument with Neil deGrasse Tyson about this when he had said some disparaging things about the atheist label and why he didn't opt to use it. Mm-hmm. And because there's so much confusion about what it means. And he said, if everybody used atheist the way you do, Matt, I would, use the term more likely. And I was like, okay, who gets to define what atheist means, first of all? I don't get to define what a true Christian is, even though I lived as one for all those years. So we need to grab the label that we're going to use, own it, and explain it.
Yes, the explaining is crucial at this point, I think.
But the other thing that I said was, okay, you're an astrophysicist. If the rest of the world started using astrophysicist in the wrong way, are you just going to dump that label too, or are you going to work to correct the one that applies to you?
Right.
And that's when he conceded. It wasn't really like a debate, but because it went down in that order, I will claim that I beat Neil deGrasse Tyson in a debate at our very first meeting, which isn't the case. And he's a great guy, and I would love to interact with him more. But I had called him a douche on the show because of some comments that he had made. And at the end of the discussion, he's like, well, you can tell the fans of the show it was okay to call me a douche. And I was like, yeah, a win. I'll take a win.
Wow.
But that the anti-intellectualism, which I think not only do we need to have better conversations about labels, teach people not to rely too much on their assumptions, but we also need people like Neil, who I greatly respect as a science communicator, because if there's anybody that has the public eye that would count as an intellectual, It's Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's Sean Carroll. It's Richard Dawkins, who I'm doing an event with in Vancouver in November. These are the intellectuals who have some expertise in communicating their fields to the general public. And they do it in such a way that if anti-intellectualism is directed at Neil deGrasse Tyson, you look far worse than if you are let me just dismiss academia in general. If you direct that at Neil, who's working his ass off to actually engage with people and and promote an interest and an understanding of the fields, you look worse for that. And so I think we need better science communicators. And we also need to encourage people to be a little self-reflective about how they're going. What baggage are you bringing to the conversation? Because if you're just going to rag on intellectualism and you're doing it on Facebook, on your computer in 2016, in the world that was built by the great advances of intellectualism, you just look silly. And that doesn't mean that we disregard those people. It's, let's advocate a little humanism and see if we can't help people realize where they're making mistakes in thought.
Good point. Now, in terms of changing hearts and minds, I really like to talk about, how you were wrong or how, being wrong, right? You gave a talk on this recently, and you made some really good points in there. What have you found to be, just for the everyman out there, what have you found to be good principles for anyone to follow in arguing or debating with other people about, like, when it gets into hot topics, sensitive issues? We're talking about religion and politics and things that are just have a lot of emotional overtones and weight to them. People get very invested in these things,
Yep.
Even to the point of irrationally being invested in them. What have you learned over the years that people could use in, talking to people in that frame of mind?
Yeah, it's so for me, step number one is you need to actually give a damn. You need to care about the subject. You need to care about other people. If you're just going into these things to show how much smarter you are than somebody else, if you're going in there with the goal of belittling them and mocking, their beliefs, and I'm fine with ridicule, which I'll get to in a minute, provided it's directed at beliefs and not people. But if that's your motivation going in, you've already made a mistake. The big tools that you need to be able to actually listen to what was said, ask questions and clarifications. The Socratic method is probably the best way to get people to realize anything. And so the more you're even phrasing your views in the form of a question, well, you say you believe in God. What exactly do you mean by that? Do you think that there's a bearded man in the sky? Are we talking about something that exists outside space-time? I need a slightly better definition of what you're talking about so I can understand it. Being able to ask questions, which also requires that you care about the answers, listening to make sure that you're responding accurately. There's a number of techniques like mirroring, okay, what I've heard you say is this, is that correct? That sort of thing. But the other, for me, I was terrified of public speaking, which is why I didn't become a preacher. I'd been a magician since I was 3. I didn't mind occasionally performing, but public speaking, even in church, was kind of nerve-wracking. And the very first press release that I did on the steps of the Capitol here in Austin, I was still kind of nervous. And now I am not nervous at all for any public speaking thing. And the reason for that is simple. If you talk about what you know, acknowledge what you don't know, and you're not trying to BS anybody, there's nothing that can go wrong. If you set your ego out of the way, and I have an ego, everybody, I'm not, I appreciate applause and cheers and laughter. I wouldn't be performing magic, and debate is a lot of theater, and I love that. But in the conversation, it can't be about me or my ideas. It has to be as objective as possible. And if I'm going in there saying, I'm unconvinced that a God exists, I'm here asking someone to convince me, and I'm explaining why what they've said hasn't convinced me, and that is all true. How can anything go wrong? I mean, anybody who despises me or looks down upon me for that, including a God, is just fundamentally wrong. Okay, maybe they think I'm an idiot and I just can't get it. I get that, but I'm not an idiot, or at least I'm sufficiently not an idiot that you should be able to explain how I am being an idiot on this subject. So, listen, actually care. Don't talk about stuff you don't know. Don't overreach. If the burden of proof is on somebody to claim that God exists, don't go claiming that you are convinced and can demonstrate that Christianity was invented in the 4th century by the Pope and the Masons. I mean, that's just moronic. Even if you were correct, unless you can clearly demonstrate that, you have made a mistake that will unfairly prop up their side.
Right.
And the one big thing is, you don't have to be an expert in everything if you're representing what you do and don't accept, if you are asking questions, if you are honestly seeking clarification. And you don't owe anybody an argument or an explanation. Outside of a formally structured public debate, one of the best tools you have is a virtual pause button. Hey, they've just said something. Hey, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. I'll jot down a note, and let's stop the conversation here. Let me go off and think about it for a while. Let me do some research, because that's a really intriguing point, and it might be right, and I don't want to dismiss it unfairly. And then maybe let's have lunch or continue this conversation another time. We don't have to settle, is there a God, over dinner at Christmas.
Right.
We can just put a pen in this and move off and have our discussion at another time, because none of us are experts in all these things. If somebody says, well, how do you explain morality if you don't have a God? And this isn't something you've spent any time thinking about. It's a mistake to dig in too deeply, because first of all, if you don't have an explanation, that makes them feel like they're more right, which is a fallacy. The fact that I don't have an explanation doesn't tell you anything about whether or not they're right. Mm-hmm. And if you do and it's flawed because you're coming up with it off the fly, you haven't spent much time researching it, it's all a mistake. So why not just say, let me think about that, research it, get back to you, and then do that. Actually, if you say, I'm going to research this and get back to you, do your best to continue that conversation with that person.
Yeah, it's not just blowing them off.
Yeah.
How do you deal with critics? I'm sure on your show and whatever else, and in debates even. How do you deal with critics who say that you're just trying to enforce your stupid beliefs or ideas on other people, and that your opinions aren't any better than anyone else's? What do you say to that?
Well, one thing is, I'm not advocating legislating, taking away anybody's beliefs by force, or advocating legislation that limits freedoms. Atheists and seculars tend to be some of the most staunch defenders of religious freedom, because, if you're part of the religious majority, why do you care about religious freedom? You've already got it. It ain't going anywhere as long as you're part of that majority. It's the minority views that help protect these things. And while I'm happy to convince people through argument and evidence and reasoning that they don't perhaps have a good reason to believe things, I am not in any way ever going to advocate forcibly taking away their beliefs or making their beliefs illegal. Or some people will say, well, if you had a wet magic wand that can wave it and religion goes away, would you do that? Well, that depends, because my goal is not to, let's just scrub religion from the realm. My goal is to get to truth and to make sure that people are reasonable. So if you gave me a magic wand that made sure that everybody was reasonable, that sucker would have been waved before you even got it completely out of your hand. I want to live in a world where everybody's reasonable. Mm-hmm. Waving away religion doesn't mean that the person who's lived their entire life as a believer has the skill set outside of religion. I need to clarify this, because this comes up over and over again. I think it is monumentally arrogant and awful to say, well, I don't need religion, but those other little people, they need religion, they need this guide. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that they're currently in a situation where that is the best tool for them, only because they haven't been given a better tool. It's not that there's something inferior about them. well, there are people who just need religion or they'd run around slaughtering people. I find that to the extent that that might be true, we're talking about a marginally, vanishingly small group of people who aren't going to be helped by reason or religion. It's not like religion stops crime. Uh, you know, I'm pretty sure that the lucrative, and I have no problem with porn, but the religionists often do have a problem with porn, and yet they're using it. It's not only atheists that are going to Pornhub or wherever.
No.
And there's the old joke that Baptists don't recognize each other in the liquor store, and and things like that. These things that they want to write off as vices. So looking at how we kind of engage, I am happy with ridiculing ideas that are ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
By definition, I think they're deserving. I don't advocate ridiculing people. And even where ridiculing an idea is warranted, I don't say that that's necessarily the best starting point, because you have to realize that you're talking to people who hold ideas dearly. There was a woman who called the show who was desperate to get on and basically said, this is important and you guys are going to hell and I'm concerned about all this. And we argued for quite some time. And she kept getting backed into a corner and backed into a corner. And I don't know what your I will censor this because I don't know what your rules on profanity are on your show.
Go ahead, whatever.
Cool. So she gets to the end of this conversation. She goes, well, okay, I guess we'll just agree to disagree. And I was like, why the fuck did you call? Because you started with this thing that this is so important. And after discussion, when you couldn't come up with any justification for your positions, then you want to just say, well, we'll just agree to disagree and we'll go. I thought this was important. And as soon as I said, why the fuck did you call? She got, so offended. How dare you use language like that with me? Now, I think I have this view that words, first of all, don't have intrinsic meaning. They have usages. And this idea of offense is something that is taken, not given. The phoneme that I just uttered, the F-U-C-K characters that go together to form, none of these things convey any meaning. This is all, you're using magical thinking to apply some power to the word itself. That doesn't go over well with everybody because words have usage. They are powerful. We use them. But if you're going to dismiss a 15 or 20 minute substantive conversation and pretend like none of that happened and that your views were not thoroughly debunked during that time period, merely because somebody uttered a word that you find offensive.
Right.
Now you are so far into the style over substance, and I'm going to take offense that I think it to me said she was looking for any way to reach that high ground that she thought she had and was beaten down, and she chose to latch onto this idea that because Matt used a word that she would never use, that's just so offensive, that this demonstrates her moral and intellectual superiority. If the profane is the last refuge of the weak mind. No,
it's a total exercise in psychology. That.
Yeah, Stephen Fry. If you Google Stephen Fry on swearing or cursing, there's a cool YouTube video that's like 2 or 3 minutes where Stephen Fry sums up everything I would want to say about offensive language rather well.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Now, sometimes I've seen this in responses that have come to me on YouTube, or I've seen this in YouTube videos and whatnot, where in the atheist skeptic community, there's this sort of attitude with some. I'm not saying this is a prevalent attitude, but it definitely exists. That because they have science on their side, they're infinitely right, and all belief is infinitely wrong or unfounded, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's but the objective truth is that there are legitimate areas of science that science hasn't covered yet, doesn't know, doesn't have figured out, right?
Okay.
When it comes to certain things. And so I'm wondering, I was very impressed when you during your talk here in Denver at your tolerance of belief. And I'm wondering, how do you answer the question, do people have a right to believe things that aren't really founded in fact? especially when it comes to areas where science hasn't gone there yet.
Well, when it comes to rights, it almost doesn't even matter whether or not we granted a right to believe something. There's no way around it. You believe what you believe, and I have no way to get into your mind, and I can't outlaw belief. So when it comes, from that sort of thing, whether or not their beliefs are justified, I have a great deal of tolerance for believers, although I have an incredible intolerance for beliefs, and not merely beliefs that are obviously false or incredibly harmful. If you're offering up racist ideas on my Facebook page, I'm going to block you immediately. And you can think, oh, Matt's too small-minded to have a discussion. I don't care. I just don't want the racist crap on my Facebook page. And I'm doing this in opposition to the ideas, to the beliefs, and not necessarily to the believer. In areas where we don't have a good understanding, and people still hold a belief, I think they're wrong. I'll point out that they're wrong. Not that their belief itself is wrong, but that they are wrong to hold that belief absent sufficient evidence. It's still well within their rights. I mean, before we had done all the research, if there were people who said, power lines lead to cancer, and they were pointing to different bits of anecdotal evidence, or hey, look, there were 12 people in this area and they put in power lines and they developed cancer. There was an episode of Practice we were watching the other night which brought that to mind. Or autism and vaccines. Before we have the information, okay, you're probably on really bad footing. You probably don't have enough information to reach the conclusion you've made, but let's evaluate it. Once we get a good scientific finding, which can change because science isn't making proclamations about absolute truth. It's just, this is the current best explanation for the observed facts. If you still continue to hold on to that, now you are standing in opposition to science. But what you're talking about is science can't tell me currently how the universe began.
Right.
And yet people have all sorts of beliefs about how the universe began.
Right.
And my position is that they are all wrong. Not that they are incorrect about the fact that they believe, but they are wrong to believe anything about this. By definition, if you don't have sufficient evidence, you should not have a belief. I've gotten in arguments with skeptic organizations or members of skeptic organizations about this because they will say skepticism doesn't lead to atheism. And what they mean is scientific skepticism, the ability to investigate a claim and confirm or debunk it, does not believe to hard atheism, the position there are no gods. Because that claim would be, we have scientifically proved there is no God.
Right.
I agree with them. What I've argued is that philosophical skepticism, the idea that my beliefs should be warranted by reason and evidence, that goal, that ideal of philosophical skepticism, does necessarily result in soft atheism, a disbelief, or I do not believe that a God exists. Because that, reformulated, means we have not confirmed that a God exists. When I said that skepticism leads to atheism, some of them lost their mind because what they heard me say was, we've scientifically proved there's no God. And what I was actually saying is, we have not scientifically reasonably confirmed that there is a God.
Right.
And partly it's because there are some people who identify as skeptics who do believe in a God. And they'll point to Martin Gardner, the father, I guess, of modern skepticism, who was a theist. But what they fail to notice is that when Martin Gardner talked about this, he recognized that he was, in his God belief, he was not being a good skeptic. He was not applying skepticism.
That's been my position from day one on that subject as well.
And they'll say, well, skepticism can't say anything about an untestable claim.
Right.
Yes, it can. Skepticism can say, by virtue of the fact that this claim is untestable, it is therefore impossible that we can have rational warrant to believe it. Not that we've concluded it's false, but that we cannot yet, we should not be convinced. And this is, we get back to what we were talking about at the start about, belief being a choice and becoming convinced, and what's your standard of evidence, and isn't that completely arbitrary and subjective? And, sure, you get your own standards of evidence, but we can also demonstrate that your standards of evidence are flawed. If you have a pair of lucky socks and you're going to cite your bowling record when wearing the lucky socks versus your bowling record when you're not wearing the lucky socks, we can point out how that is a flawed epistemology that does not lead to truth. That you are firmly in the realm of superstition, and not that you're wrong. Maybe you do have a lucky pair of socks, but the sort of testing we would need to confirm that you have a lucky pair of socks is not what you're basing your decision on.
Right.
And so this is what happens in a lot of discussions. I don't think there's an absolute anything. I don't think there's any path to absolute certainty anywhere, including that statement, because that somebody always brings that up in the comments. Oh, are you absolutely sure that you're not absolutely sure? Oh, no,
You're right.
I never thought of that
The
one.
tautology is
Yeah.
a tautology. So,
Yes, thank you. So the thing is, people desperately want absolute certainty. And so they'll say, oh, well, if you don't have some absolute objective standard of what is or isn't a rational foundation of evidence for a particular belief or category of beliefs, then it's just anything goes. That's not true. They do the same thing with morality. If there's no absolute objective standard in a God, then it's chaos and hedonism. No, it doesn't. You don't have to do this all or nothing thinking.
right.
All or nothing thinking is going to destroy the world. That doesn't mean that we have to find, that doesn't mean the truth lies in the middle. Like you say this, I say this. Oh, the truth isn't. No, that's not what I'm saying either.
Right.
This lack of absolute certainty doesn't put the truth in the middle. What it does do, and what it should do, and we don't see this enough in politics either, is when we recognize that neither one of us have an answer to this, that now, until we come up with an answer, we need to do one of a couple of things. Not have any position, or come up with some sort of compromise that allows us to adjust when we have more information.
Right.
I find partisan politics, I was listening to a couple of interviews this week, just absolutely bizarre. Because in this election cycle, we have Trump and Clinton. In case somebody's watching this years afterwards, maybe I'll look like a prophet. They are both despised by huge chunks of the population.
Right.
And when we start talking about the facts of things, I hear the advocates. I've heard Republican senators who would never have said anything at all good about Trump, desperately trying to make him sound like, oh, he's the real he's the real deal. And it's because they're so anti-Clinton. And I've heard the same thing the other way.
Right.
It seems to me that I listen to these interviews, and somebody like Chris Matthews or somebody will ask a question and desperately try to hold the pundit or representative's feet to the fire, answer this question, and they'll duck and dodge and swift and swerve, and it's like Daffy Duck, flipping everything around and duck, parry, dodge, boom. And even a simple question like, hey, do you think Trump should apologize for birtherism? Instead of just saying yes or no, or even saying, I would do it, but I understand why he doesn't, or no, I don't necessarily think that apology is the right thing. Any of those. It is, well, the important thing to remember is that Trump is out there talking about blah, blah, blah.
Right.
It's nowhere near the question.
Right.
And, I look at this, and the thing that terrifies me, and I don't think it'll come as much of a surprise that I'm not a Trump supporter, is that I could have gone in 3 months ago and advised Trump, and if he'd listened to me, he would definitely be president and leading the race, because there have been enough mistakes from the other side that could have been capitalized well, but he's such a Trump that there were failures to capitalize those, and in some cases just made it worse. Hey, let me pull you out to my new hotel and talk about how wonderful I am and how huge the hotel is. And then I'll just say Obama was born in the United States with no explanation, no apology, no nothing, and move on. That was the stupidest thing he could have done.
That's right.
And it's an easy fix, because he could have said, yeah, I thought this, for a while. And he released his long form birth certificate, and I got information that it wasn't necessarily correct. But I've continued to investigate this and everything else. I am now convinced that I was mistaken before, that he was born in the United States. Why, let's focus on the race at hand. It would there's nothing magnanimous about him, and there's no way that he's going to say that he's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if he did, I think that would overcome a lot of his negatives for some people, not for me, but for some people.
Right.
But this avoidance of the truth, and I don't mean to necessarily get political, it's just the example that's on my mind, is about loyalty to party over truth. And we see the same thing in discussions about religion. I'm so devoted to my religious idea that I'm going to twist and turn and avoid the conversation anytime it doesn't seem that the truth is on my side. And for the people who would say, oh, you're just as bad, which was the question you asked an hour ago that I've rambled on about, no, I'm not just as bad, because what I'm advocating is for truth, for nuance, for reasonableness. And if you can show me where I'm actually wrong, guess what? Of the two of us in this conversation, I'm the one who has repeatedly acknowledged when I've been wrong. I was wrong about Christianity. I was wrong about religion in general. I was wrong about any number of other things. I was wrong about gay rights. I was wrong about, I don't know, pick a laundry list of things. I'm the one who's shown that they can change their mind based on new evidence and reasoned argument. And I don't find that that's the case very often with the people I'm talking to about their religion, including the ones who want to say, oh, I don't think that the Bible is literal and I'm not like Westboro. I'm one of the good ones. Well, you're probably a very good person, and I will applaud you all day long for being better than the religion you still acknowledge as yours.
Right.
But you can be better. Why are you clinging to this thing that's you're still dragging this weight along through life, saying, yeah, I'm still dragging the weight along, but at least I'm not swinging it around and hitting people in the face with it. But it's still my baggage to drag along, and it still comforts me. No, it doesn't comfort you. You know, people are like, I hear messages from people who've given up their religion and are despondent and sad, and there's no afterlife, and there's no this, and all these things that they've been promised. And how do I deal with that? And I feel so sad, and I do whatever I can to try to give them advice and help them. But I never experienced that. I was a fundamentalist for 25 plus years. When I found my way out, it was freeing. It was, oh, there's not somebody spying on my every action, judging me by a standard I could never live up to, planning out what I'm going to do for my life.
Mm.
You know, what's the meaning and purpose to life? If you were a college student and your parents picked your major, or your guidance counselor picked your major, or the government assigned what your job would be, everybody would revolt. That is a violation of freedom. And yet somehow when it comes to religion, people are comforted by the idea that God has a plan for their life, that God is steering the ship. The very same thing that they would revolt if it were coming from anything other than God. And I can't think
No,
of
it's an amazing irony. I have experienced both things you just talked about. I've experienced the relief from leaving a totalitarian, sort of authoritarian religious situation,
yeah,
Scientology, but at the same time, after that wore off, you know, the freedom and the euphoria and the wonderfulness of that no longer being a monkey on my back or an albatross around my neck came, you know, the hard decisions and the hard look of, well, now what?
yeah.
Now what do I do? You know, because all I knew was I didn't want to go into that again.
Well,
But
Dennis,
what do you think? Where do you go? How do you? And that's when I found critical thinking, and thank God for it. I say
sure.
euphemistically, but you know,
No, I'm
I
not giving up. I'm not giving. I'm not. I don't allow religions to keep all the good curse words or the colloquial phrases. Dennis LeBay, who is on nonprofits, which I'll actually be on guesting with tonight. He and I did nonprofits for a long time. One of the things that he said, which should be obvious, it's so. It's funny to me how the things that should be obvious, that when you hear the right person say it in the right way, just become so profound. And somebody had emailed in to say, okay, when you get rid of religion, what do you replace it with? And Dennis, without missing a beat, said, when you cure the cancer, what do you replace it with?
mhm,
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought about it like that.
right,
Now, you know, when we were talking earlier about, you know, people who need reasonable guidance that religion gives them on, or unreasonable religious guidance on morality needs to be replaced with reasonable secular guidance on morality. Um, But a lot of it comes down to asking the wrong question. I remember people have called in the show and said, well, if God didn't create the universe, who did? Well, that's not a who question. The question is, what is the explanation for the universe? And that question allows you to say the explanation for the universe is God, or universe creating pixies, or this scientific mechanism, or we don't know, or even we may never know what the explanation is. If you ask the wrong question, you have no hope of getting the right answer.
Very good point. You know, the three most important words in critical thinking: I don't know.
And actually, I extend
it's hard to have that state of mind for a lot of people, though.
I extend that.
They can't tolerate a question mark.
It's very frustrating. I've given a couple talks on the power of I don't know. And I extend this because people will email me. I don't have any kids of my own, but they'll say, oh, I've got kids and I'm in a relationship where I'm an atheist and, you know, my spouse is not, or I have nieces and nephews and they're being raised by fundamentalists. And what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And I always encourage them, teach kids how to think, not what to think, try and encourage a spirit of discovery. But the most important thing is not just to be willing to say, I don't know. When I talk to kids, I treat them like they're real people, even if they're not. I engage with them in the same way I engage with somebody else. I try not to ever do baby talk. And if my niece or nephew, or in the future if I have kids, if one of them comes up and asks me a question and I don't know what the answer is, not only do I and will I say, I don't know, but I want to follow it up every single time with, let's see if we can find out.
Yes.
Because now we've got a question. A grown-up doesn't know the answer. Ooh. And then it becomes a game of, how could we find out? Is there some other grown-up that has the answer? Is there a kid who has the answer? Does anybody in the universe have the answer? How would we go about testing this? And it encourages this sense of discovery and exploration that is how we cultivate minds to be free from the trappings of the pat answers of religions and superstitions and other pseudoscience-y crap.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a long-term solution to get people doing that will lead us to a more rational society.
We are on the cusp of having to answer and deal with really, really big questions related to, identity, particularly with regard to DNA research, potentials within, I don't want to go the science fiction route. I'm not a transhumanist, but there are going to be questions about identity and cloning and genetics and all sorts of things that are hard, but they're made impossible if we're still sitting around arguing over whether there's a God or whether evolution is true, whether homosexuals should be allowed to be in a loving, committed, married relationship with it. And if we're still bickering over the little stuff that we should have solved a long time ago, we're never going to be able to address the bigger questions. And it's one of the reasons why, like I said, my goal isn't necessarily to scrub out religion, although I think that's a side effect of the goal. But to encourage a secular, reasonable, science-based view of the world may be our only hope. And we get into arguments about ethics and how much science can say about that. I'm mostly in agreement with Sam Harris with a couple of caveats, but it's far too big to get into now after talking an hour and a half.
Totally. I have one last question, and I hope we can squeeze in here. And it could be a big answer, but let's make it a short one and just say, when it comes to violence, we have a situation on this planet with violence, and a lot of that violence is painted as stemming from religion, especially from the atheist camp. Now, there's a question here of, is it actually stemming from religious belief or extremism? That's the problem. What do you think on that issue?
Well, it depends. So religion, we were talking about labels earlier. Religion is a label that we put on something that is already an oversimplification. Religion isn't one thing. And if you pick a specific religion, it's still not one thing. You can't just pick Christianity and say that it's all the same. Because I know people who identify as atheist Christians who don't believe any of the supernatural, but think that there's, good moral messages, kind of the way Thomas Jefferson did when he cut his Bible apart to remove references to the supernatural. There's no way to identify which one is the true religion, I tend to go with the idea that those who are operating on the basis of a plain reading of the text are on firmer grounds than those who are going with specialized divine revelation and interpretations. If your holy book says, if a man lays with another man as he lays with a woman, they have committed an abomination and are deserving of death, that may not be an instruction for you to kill them, but the idea that they are deserving of death is clearly literally there.
Right.
Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Okay, now you've got a little bit more of an explicit call to violence. If you go to the Quran, and I think it's Surah 489 or somewhere in that vicinity, it talks about apostates and how they are to be put to death. When you have a clear message like that, it's all well and good to say, oh, well, that was the case in that time in this place, and then there's this other verse or passage that renders it irrelevant. I watched a great debate a couple weeks ago between Matt Slick, who's a Calvinist, and I think his name's Jesse Morrell, who's not, both Christians, arguing over the process of salvation and whether it is free will based or if it is election based, that God chooses this.
Mm.
And the cool thing is they each sat there and went Bible verse, Bible verse, Bible verse, Bible, boom, 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 better than I could have ever done, even when I was at my most knowledgeable about the Bible. And now I just remember the verses that are useful for me.
Right.
And I agreed with both of them. Both of them presented verses that very clearly supported their position. And my takeaway from this was the obvious. You are both referencing a book that can say whatever you want it to say,
Exactly.
or reason support either one of you.
Right.
That's what they take away from it. As long as that's the case, I think it is fair. People will ask me, well, what about Islam? What do you think about Islam? Is Islam the most dangerous religion on the planet? Yeah, probably. Right now, when you talk about what makes a religious view dangerous, when you have a particular ideology that is supported as a state, government sort of thing that has armed militias and are actively, working in opposition, when atheist bloggers are being killed in Bangladesh by Muslims,
Yep.
and they're not being killed in the United States by Christians, you can talk about how awful Christianity is, and I will. But what we're seeing is that individual Christians and individual sects have been pulled, dragging, kicking, and screaming from the Dark Ages by Enlightenment ideas. And the same thing hasn't happened with all versions of Islam.
Right.
So it's not fair to say, and as a generalized thing, that violence is caused by religion. Nope. Violence is caused by human beings, and
Mm-hmm.
is the ideologies behind them that help foster and encourage that. It is the society that they've grown up with. And the fact is, we live in a time where some versions of Islam, which one could argue are more literal, become what we end up labeling extremist, even though I think it'd be just as fair to call them literalist fundamentalist as extremist. And they engage in acts of violence, and it's dangerous, and it needs to be stopped, and it needs to be exposed. And I'm not at all afraid to talk about radical Islamic extremists. I'm fine with the language, because there's also radical Christian extremists who bomb abortion clinics.
That's right.
I'm not aware of any radical Scientology extremists. However, I never actually got to spend any time with the Sea Org, and some of the stories I've heard about locking people in closets to the point where they're dead, that may qualify, but that's more violence against their own instead of violence against the outside world.
That's right.
And so when you take any ideology that creates this us-them divide that makes this group others, it's amazing. Hey, Muslims can live in America nice and peacefully, and they're up in Dearborn, and they're not causing any problems. And see, look, here we're going to reference this. Cool. But that's also comparing apples to oranges, because they have no power base. They don't have a government. They don't have a militia. In the areas where Islam has a government and militia, they are killing their own, and they are actively working to kill outsiders and people who don't adhere to their religious beliefs. How much of that is a function of the religion versus the religious ideology that comes forth from it? When we talk about religion, are we talking about the holy book that is the guidance? Are we talking about the religious schools and teachings? Are we talking about the culturalized religious state?
Right.
Because Catholics are different from Protestants, and Baptists are different from Episcopalians and Lutherans and Pentecostals. It's not something you can easily just say, religion causes violence. But I think it's pretty easy to say that some versions of religions, whether you're talking about the Holy Book or the state or the power base or the community, foster and encourage violent tendencies within human beings. And the one very clear exception to that, there's a couple of others where they go to the, Jains or ultra pacifist. But the one clear exception to that is secular humanism, which doesn't and couldn't encourage violence. There's nothing you can point to that says, hey, the Secular Humanist Manifesto, if interpreted correctly, will lead us to go blow up this abortion clinic or, drop bombs in New York against the infidels. That just cannot happen.
Exactly. Well, you nailed it with the us versus them mentality, because that any group that fosters that fosters a difference between people where that justification of violence is just a next logical step.
Yeah, religion doesn't get a free pass.
No.
But it's also it's a mistake to dump it all and just, it's religion. It can be. I think one of the things that the secular community and maybe the world at large is missing is nuance.
Perfect. Yep.
By relying on labels and shortcuts and the 140 character Twitter post and the quick, meme picture I'm going to throw up on Facebook as the sum total of my feelings about a subject, we've condensed things to the point where I think we're doing ourselves a great disservice, and we're actually widening the divide between any us and any them.
Exactly. Preach, man. I think another good term for critical thinking might be nuanced thinking.
You may be right.
Yeah,
I'll have to think about it.
Yeah. So, listen, we're definitely out of time. I've asked you all my questions. I thank you very much for the time that you've given me here, and I very much enjoyed your answers.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
And so I hope you enjoyed that interview with Matt. I know I certainly did, and I learned a lot from him. Also, if you might have noticed, if you've been listening closely to the podcast, that I am wearing a new Sensibly Speaking podcast shirt. This just arrived this week and is available on my Critical Merchandise store if you're interested in promoting my podcast and also throwing some love and support my way. This is 100% a fan-funded activity. I am here because of your guys' ability, giving me the ability to be here, and this is a pitch. I do want you guys to continue to support this show and my channel, and please do so either through my Patreon campaign. That's the best way to do it, or through PayPal, or through buying my products. So with that, I will leave you for this week. Thank you very much for coming around. I would love any and all feedback. Please throw it my way, and maybe I will address it in our next show. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you guys next week.